So to me, this verse is problematic for compatibilism or like the Calvinistic reading of scripture. So I just want to make a few comments, and I love feedback from anybody who holds that view. Let's see. So to me, this is one of the texts that's hard to make sense of if the author's intention was or understanding of, how God operates in the life of the believer. It's hard for me to understand or to imagine him even saying these words if he intends us to believe a sort of compatibilistic view of God's sovereignty and the freedom of humans who sin or obey. He says, therefore, let him who thinks. So the context here is the example of what not to do that the Israelites did in the wilderness, for instance, and how they suffered judgment because they, you can also like I would argue in Hebrews, what talks about if you don't follow after God, you're storing up wrath for the day of wrath when God renders to all according to his deeds. But hold fast, basically, and he who for your hope, for he who will come and he will not tarry, right? And we're not like those who fall back unto perdition, but endure to the end, sort of idea, right? It's an exhortation and a promise in a certain sense, and a warning all at the same time. To endure, to not fall back like those who did by example, that we are not to do that. These things happen to them as examples and were written for our admonition so that we wouldn't do that. They are an example for what we ought not to do. To learn from that so we can make the willing decision to do what is necessary so that we don't do the thing they did. In other words, that's the context. So this is literally warning people who say you can't lose your salvation. If you think about what the purpose of this text is in 1 Corinthians 10, he tells you about things where people fell back, and he's saying, don't do that. And then notice this therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Seems like he wouldn't say that either if he didn't think you could. This is like saying, be careful. It's kind of like, don't think that God cut off the Jews so that you could have a seat in, and then that you can't fall either, like they were. Romans 11 is the same sort of rebuke there too about Gentiles. And people read that, well, don't think God's put away the Jews. No, the point there is some Jews were put away because of disbelief. It's not talking corporately. It's talking about individual examples of people who didn't follow God within the elect body. And he's warning people within the elect body not to do the same thing because you can fall. So let him think who he stands lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape that you might be able to bear it. In other words, this to me is so obviously saying, even though you're God's people, you can fall away like they did in the past. You can, if you don't want to think it's I think ultimately you can make a case that this isn't about losing your salvation, although it really is probably, but otherwise it doesn't make any sense. But the point is what this is talking about. Sorry, I'm having all these thoughts about how to interpret this. But the point here is that you don't have to, but it's possible. Whether it's salvific or just falling into sin. The point is, the thrust of this is saying, and God offers a way of escape, just like he did in the past. Some people didn't fall away in the wilderness or whatever, or in the Old Testament. And God offers that way of escape, right? That you may be able to bear it. So God has an elect people, and some of them fell through disbelief. And this is telling you to warn you to not be part of that group within the elect that fell away through disbelief, essentially. So if you stay faithful to God, he'll get you through it, is the idea. But that's not necessarily the case. And that's the purpose of this text. Now, the idea that demands the idea that no individual particular person has to be part of either group by necessity. And now, if God knows which ones those are, we don't know why he doesn't stop that from happening. But here it's saying it's not his fault, but it would be your fault through disbelief, it seems to me. And that it's not necessary that you be part of either group by necessity, which isn't the same thing as certainty. Certainty would be, if it is in fact the case, which I think it seems to be likely, and that's what most people have thought historically, that God probably knows who those are. And then the question would be, why doesn't he do more to stop it? But that's another discussion. The point is, what is this text actually saying? And is it a real warning that you don't have to, by necessity, be one who falls away or doesn't fall away, whether or not God knows it and its certainty or not? So if it is the case that that's true, now here's what it seems to me, in talking to Calvinists, how you would write this, and this is kind of you could say polemical or whatever, but it seems like this is what it would say if the distinctions of Calvinism are true. So you can see the text on the screen. Now here's the version. It seems how it would be said if what the truth is about this, if compatibilism is true. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he presumes he can know he is one of the elect. No temptation has overtaken you, except such is what God determined for you to do for certain. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to resist being tempted beyond what he has ordained, will certainly cause you to commit a sin. But with the temptation will also make a way of escape and impossibility. And be especially upset if you think you could have done otherwise. Because thinking you could have done otherwise is a false belief about God. You would be denying God's sovereignty. Every act of sin in every instance is exactly what he secretly decreed you would do, and God still has a reason to condemn you, even though you had to do it, because he made it so you wanted to do it in such a way no other possibilities existed or could exist. Is that true? And does that not say the exact opposite of what this text is actually saying? See, that's what the text, something like that is what's really true if Calvinism is true, but that seems to be exactly the opposite of what this text is conveying in its context. So I'm trying to illustrate that. Like, how can you really know if you're the elect? Ultimately, because under that, internally in a critique, you couldn't really know for sure until the end, because you endure, because you persevere. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you do. It just matters if you're one of the elect, which means you're one of the ones that were chosen, but you couldn't know that until the very end. So you can't have assurance. No temptation has overtaken you, then what is God determined for you to do for certain? But God is faithful, who will not allow you to resist being tempted beyond what he ordained, so that what you do is exactly what he wanted you to do. Is that what that's saying? Is that the reality of it? Or does he offer you a way of escape so that you can bear it? Meaning you should bear it and can bear it. Well, how do you do that? That's how this text flies in the face of what Calvinists say. In what way are you able to bear it if you take the way of escape? If it can only happen if God ordained that to happen, how does this text make any sense? How could anybody who believed, because obviously if determinism and compatibilism are true, Paul would have believed that, because that would be the intent of the author. How would Paul have written this verse on the screen if he was thinking those distinctions, if those distinctions that you tell me are true, that I don't believe, because that's the intent of the author, then Paul has that intention. How could somebody who has that intention write these words in this verse? He would not say that. He would say something like the exact opposite of what this is conveying. But even if, let's say, somehow this verse means something totally different than how most people have always read it and what it seems to be saying, what could he possibly be meaning if he had those distinctions in mind? What would make him, what is this saying? What is it supposed to mean? That a person who believed those distinctions that compatibilists make, what would ever make them say these words? That requires I think that question demands a really good answer to be taken seriously. I'm getting it from the text. I'm asking, this is a question. What can this possibly mean that everyone has missed? That there is there's like, even if you take many options of what this is ultimately saying, seems like somebody who believed compatibilism would not say it, because it just sounds so much like non-compatible, like some things you would never say as a compatibilist. It just flies in the face of every argument a compatibilist makes. And that kind of person would never say this sort of thing in the text. But I've never heard a Calvinist talk about this text in such a way where that's not the case. Oh, look how everyone's totally misunderstood this verse. If the author really believed that, compatibilist, and that's the right way to read the Bible, you just wouldn't say something like this, is the point. So, unless you want to say, well, that's how it works, but you're supposed to pretend like compatibilism isn't actually true and operate that way. Now you're really going above the Bible if that's the case. So we'll act like you can do otherwise. And okay, I want to know, is the Bible saying is it the suggestion that you can do otherwise? And I'm going to say, obviously, yes. That's what rebellion means and why people are punished for it. For the purpose of teaching them to make the right decisions because they can and should. And that would be better. But if you actually can't, then it's a ruse. The whole thing's a ruse. It's not true. Again, this is where the question comes up. Does the fact that the Bible operates telling us what we should do, does that require the reality that you can? Just should suggest could. It seems to me for the Bible to be honest or to not be misleading, could does suggest should, or should does require the ability of could. Otherwise, it's a cruel joke that comes up all the time in these discussions. I'm not using the right, how do they say it? If the Bible says you should, does it necessitate the reality of a could? Does ought suggest could? Does ought suggest you can? Should, could, shoulda, coulda, woulda. Fool me twice, shame on me. Anyway.